Amidst the chaos and violence that ensued following the collapse of the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires at the end of World War I, new states began to emerge, and armies maneuvered across shifting front lines. Kiev found itself at the center of this upheaval as Ukrainian and Polish nationalists, Bolshevik revolutionaries, and White Russian counter-revolutionaries vied for control over what is now Ukraine. In the late 19th century, the region that now constitutes modern-day Ukraine was divided between the Austrian and Russian empires. The inhabitants spoke various languages, including Ukrainian, Russian, Polish, German, Yiddish, Tatar, and others. Throughout the 19th century, Ukrainian speakers often faced pressure to adopt other languages, such as Russian, Polish, or German, as these provided better access to higher education and career opportunities. Most Ukrainian speakers did not hold significant positions in the bureaucracy or politics or either empire. The majority were peasants working the land, which were predominantly owned by Polish or Russian landlords, or by Ukrainian landlords who had been Polonized or Russified. In Russian-controlled cities like Kiev and Kharkiv, Russian was dominant language, though this did not necessarily indicate that people identified as ethnic Russians, since language was not the sole determinant of national identity in Central and Eastern Europe. Similar to other regions of Eastern Europe, a Ukrainian nationalist movement began to gain traction in the 19th century. Figures such as the poet Taras Shevchenko, historian Mikhail Horashevsky, and the Greek Catholic Church played key roles in shaping a modern-day Ukrainian identity. Horashevsky, in particular, developed a historical narrative that traced Ukrainian national history back to the medieval Kievan Rus, challenging the Russian claim that Russia was the sole heir to this medieval state's legacy. However, Ukrainian nationalists faced significant challenges. Many peasants were illiterate. The concept of modern-day nation-state was unfamiliar to them, and the Russian Empire actively suppressed the Ukrainian language, fearing that a distinct Ukrainian identity could lead to rebellion against the Tsar. The 1876 EMS Ukaz, a secret decree, banned new publications, public performances, and the import of works in Ukrainian. Many Russian intellectuals even dismissed Ukrainians as merely Little Russians. In contrast, the late 19th century Austro-Hungarian authorities allowed the use of Ukrainian in public life and education. It was only after the 1905 revolution that Russian authorities granted limited freedom for Ukrainian expression, which in turn fueled a growing independence movement and national revival. By 1907, journalist Wilhelm Feldman observed the increasing prominence of Ukrainian national aspirations. The Ukrainian independence movement, still relatively small but steadily growing, reached a turning point in 1914 with two significant events. In March of that year, the Tsarist government denied Ukrainians the right to celebrate the centenary of their national poet, Taras Shevchenko, which intensified nationalist sentiment among Ukrainians. Another crucial event that year was the outbreak of World War I, which profoundly impacted Ukrainian aspiration for national self-determination. Ukrainian territories, particularly Austrian Galicia, faced severe hardships during the conflict of 1914 and 1915. Ukrainians were involved on both sides of the struggle, with 28,000 volunteering for the Austro-Hungarian army. However, both empires were wary that Ukrainians might be loyal to the opposite side. Austrian authorities suspected Ukrainians of espionage on behalf of Russians, leading to the internment of tens of thousands and the execution of many more. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary sought to foster anti-Russian sentiments among Ukrainians within the Russian Empire by supporting the formation of the Union for the Liberation of Ukraine. In response, the Russians tightened their control over the Ukrainian language and cultural institutions. As the war progressed, Russian dissidents such as Vladimir Lenin began to recognize the aspirations of minority groups, including Ukrainians. Lenin saw these groups as potential allies in a struggle to overthrow the Tsarist regime. although he continued to believe that Ukraine should remain part of unified Russian political and economic entity. Prior to February 1917 revolution, Lenin viewed minority movement primarily as tools to advance the socialist cause. However, Lenin had a limited understanding of Ukrainian issues, and like many Russian intellectuals, assumed that Ukrainian had a strong attachment to what they perceived as a superior Russian culture and economic power. When the February Revolution of 1917 replaced the Tsar with a weak Russian republic, Ukrainian nationalist groups saw an opportunity to push for an independent Ukraine. On March 17, 1917, the day after the Tsar abdication, the Society of Ukrainian Progressives announced the creation of their own governing council, the Central Rada, ran by Mikhail Taras Shevchenko. The Rada aimed to govern Ukraine as an autonomous entity within a future Russian federal system, although such a system did not yet exist and was not part of the new Russian government's plan in St. Petersburg. Instead, the Russian government proposed autonomous administration for Ukraine, excluding the industrial regions of Donbass and the Black Sea coast. The Rada rejected this proposal and declared its intention to enact its own laws. In the subsequent nationwide elections in Russia, which focused heavily on land reform, the Ukrainian Socialist Revolutionary Party, UPSR, achieved a decisive victory with strong support from the peasantry. Although the UPSR was allied with the Russian Socialist Revolutionary Party, it pursued an independent path for Ukraine. At the Kharkiv Presence Congress in May 1917, a UPSR delegate referenced the Ukrainian Cossack state's 17th century struggle against Polish lords. However, not everyone in Ukraine supported the push for independence and national development. Urban areas with their higher concentration of Russian and Jews offered significant resistance to the nationalist movement. Only about 10% of the urban electorate supported pro-Ukrainian parties. The Bolsheviks, in an attempt to attract votes, offered ambiguous support for the Ukrainian cause, but only garnered around 5% of the vote in Ukraine. Although few Ukrainians supported the Bolsheviks during the brief period of the Russian Republic, their stance on Ukraine shifted dramatically once the Bolsheviks came to power in October 1917. Initially, troops loyal to Rada supported Lenin during the revolution, believing that the Bolsheviks were sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause. However, this relationship quickly deteriorated as Lenin began enforcing a more centralized policy. He emphasized the socio-economic unity of Russia and argued that self-determination should not undermine the unity of the proletariat. Fellow Bolshevik Joseph Stalin opposed granting significant autonomy to Ukrainians and other groups within the former Russian Empire, fearing that such region might fall under imperialists' control. He stated, "We oppose the separation of the border regions from Russia because such separation would lead to imperialist domination of these regions, thereby weakening the revolutionary power of Russia and strengthening the position of imperialism." As the Bolsheviks' aggressive intentions became clear, the Rada changed its stance on November 6, 1917. The council declared its opposition to the October Revolution and vowed to defend itself, which it did during a Bolshevik-inspired uprising in Kiev the following week. On the 19th, the Rada announced the establishment of the Ukrainian People's Republic, UPR, but clarified that it did not seek full independence from Russia and was open to joining a future Russian federal system. Despite this, the UPR issued its own currency, displayed its own blue and yellow flag, although the colors were reversed compared to the modern version. The Bolshevik response came on December 16. Lenin issued an ultimatum to the Ukrainian government, acknowledging the Ukrainian People's Republic right to exist, but accusing it of pursuing a two-faced bourgeois policy, the supporting counter-revolutionary forces. Lenin also demanded security guarantees, including support for the Red Army. The Ukrainians were given 48 hours to comply or face war. The collapse of these empires resulted in the creation of a new Polish Republic and a second Ukrainian state, known as the West Ukrainian People's Republic, WUPR. Both states laid claim to the linguistically and ethnically diverse former Austro-Hungarian province of East Galicia, with its principal city, Lemberg, in November 1918. Clashes between Polish and West Ukrainian nationalists in Lemberg escalated into the Ukrainian-Polish War of 1919. Poland, being significantly stronger and backed by the Allies, and in its fight against Bolshevik Russia, gained the upper hand. Arnold Margolin, head of the Ukrainian delegation at the Paris Peace Conference, voiced his frustration. Faced with better trained and better equipped Polish forces, the WUPR sought assistance from the UPR. Although the two Ukrainian republics formally united in 1990, their cooperation proved ineffective in practice. The WUPR's main adversary was Poland, while the UPR's primary opponent was Bolshevik Russia. Since Poland was also engaged in conflict with Bolshevik Russia, the UPR was reluctant to become involved in the Western Ukrainian struggle. By May 1919, Polish forces had defeated the WUPR army and taken control of East Galicia. By mid-1919, Poland had effectively dismantled the West Ukrainian state. Meanwhile, the Kiev-based UPR, still fragile after its reestablishment by the Directory, faced the advancing fronts of the Russian Civil War. The Civil War, which was fragmenting the former Russian Empire, turned Ukraine into a major battleground involving Bolshevik revolutionaries, while counter-revolutionaries, anarchists, peasants' movement, and Allied intervention forces. The Bolshevik leadership was divided on where to focus their efforts in late 1918 and early 1919. They launched an offensive to recapture Kharkiv and reestablish a Ukrainian Socialist Republic, hoping that success in Ukraine might open a corridor to support the struggling Hungarian Soviet Republic. Red Army commander Vladimir Antonov of Shevchenko was so frustrated by the lack of reinforcements for his Kharkiv offensive that he bypassed his superior and appealed directly to Lenin. Antonov of Shevchenko also urged Lenin to permit the formation of a separate Ukrainian Communist Party before the invasion began, to lend legitimacy to Bolshevik efforts in Ukraine. Ultimately, Lenin approved the formation of Ukrainian Communist Party before the invasion commenced in December 1918. The Red Army captured Kharkiv in January, Kiev in February, and confronted French and Greek troops who had entered southern Ukraine, but these forces withdrew by April 1919. The Bolsheviks then established the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic. However, their implementation of land collectivization generated significant resentment among peasants who opposed communal ownership. Once again, this state would not endure for long. In May 1919, the anti-revolutionary White Russian Army surged out of southern Russia and advanced into Ukraine. General Anton Denikin forces captured Kharkiv and Donbass in July and controlled most of Ukraine by August. Their aim was to reintegrate Ukraine into a reconstituted Russian Empire if they won the Civil War. As different armies moved through Ukraine, terror often followed, particularly targeting Jewish communities. Between 1918 and 1920, approximately 1,500 anti-Semitic pogroms occurred in Ukraine. Most of this violence was perpetrated by the White Russian Army and Ukraine nationalist groups, though the Red Army and Polish forces were involved to a lesser extent. Both the Directory and the Whites associated local Jewish population with Bolshevism, resulting in tragic outcomes, with over 100,000 Jews killed in Ukraine during this period. By the summer of 1919, when the White Russian had taken control of most of Ukraine, the country had already been ravaged by civil war, making the prospects for an independent Ukraine appear grim. The only certainty was ongoing conflict. In late 1919, the Red Army secured a decisive victory over the Whites and began advancing south into Ukraine once again. Red forces recaptured Kiev for the first time in December and expelled the remaining Whites from Crimea in 1920. However, unpopular Bolshevik land politics and political repression soon alienated many Ukrainian peasants. Ukrainian communist Vladimir Zhatonsky later remarked that while many peasants were supporters of the idea of a socialist society, they became disillusioned with a particular form of communism being enforced by the party. Ukraine's turmoil worsened in the spring of 1920 as the Polish-Soviet War intensified. Polish forces launched an assault on the Red Army and advanced as far as Kiev. Simon Petliura, who had fled to Poland following his defeat by the Red Army, led his remaining Ukrainian troops in alliance with the Poles. Petliura's collaboration with the Poland, which had previously defeated the West Ukrainian, caused considerable resentment among other Ukrainian leaders. Former Directory member and socialist Vladimir Lenin sharply criticized Petliura, calling him an unhealthy ambition maniac, soaked in the blood of pogromized Jews, politically ignorant, a pernicious and filthy gladiator slave of the intent. However, Polish success in Ukraine was short-lived. The Red Army mounted a counter-offensive in June 1920, recaptured Kiev, and pushed the Polish forces back to Warsaw. The peace treaty was followed in 1921, left most of what is now Western Ukraine under Polish control, while the remainder came under Bolshevik Russian rule. To win over the Ukrainian population, Lenin initially refrained from imposing the harsh Russification politics that had marked the earlier Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic, at least temporarily. He allowed some level of Ukrainian national expression as long as it conformed to international socialism. Nonetheless, Lenin's position on self-determination was contradictory. He officially permitted the Ukrainian Soviet government to secede from Russia if it chose to do so, but strongly advised against it. Stalin, on the other hand, had more practical concerns regarding Ukrainian strategic importance. It wasn't long before even the nominal autonomy of the Ukrainian Communist Party vanished. In May 1920, the Red Army absorbed the Ukrainian Communist military units, and the party's Central Committee assumed control over Ukraine's administration, disbanding the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry. In 1922, Soviet Ukraine became one of 4 founding republics of USSR, alongside Russian, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Federation Republic, although these republics theoretically had the right to secede from the Union. This was not practically feasible. By 1922, Ukraine had emerged from war, chaos, and famine without achieving independent statehood, despite numerous efforts. Over 1 million lives had been lost. It wasn't until 1991 that Ukraine would finally exit the Soviet Union, establish an independent republic, readopting the yellow and blue flag that had been banned for over 17 years.